Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Cube Productions. I'm Crown Grace Kokon. Let's get into video. Today's video we're asking a question of what if Tito never led Yugoslavia? So as always we're going to go through some of the history of Yugoslavia and about Tito himself, and then we're going to get on to some of the alternative history scenarios, right? So first of all, who was Tito and what was Yugoslavia? Well, Yugoslavia, just for those who don't know, right? So the Slavs are people who predominantly live in Eastern Europe, right? Not every country in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is very confusing when it comes to different language groups, and it's to do with, you know, stuff from like the Roman time. It's long to explain, yeah, but it's different migration patterns and stuff, right? But all you need to know at the moment is that you have three different Slavic groups. So you have the Western Slavs, who are the people who live in like Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Then you've got the Eastern Slavs, who are Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, etc. And then you've got the Southern Slavs, right? And these are people who tend to live in Serbia, in Croatia, in Bulgaria, etc. These kind of countries, right? So within this, you have what's known as Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia comes from the common Slavic word. So I know a little bit of Russian, so I know that Yug means south in Russian. So Yugoslavia means the land of the Southern Slavs, right? So that's the meaning of Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia hasn't always existed, right? And it currently doesn't exist now. So many of you guys will not know much of the history of this. So that's what we're going to kind of explain in this video. So within what would later become Yugoslavia, you had multiple different ethnic groups here. So you had the Slovenes, you had the Croats, you had the Serbs, you had the Macedonians, the Kosovans, etc., etc. And obviously like the Bosnians as well, of course. Don't want to forget any different groups within this, right? And the Montenegrins, I just remembered another one, right? But the point is this, right? You had someone called Joseph Broz, who would later be known as Tito. That was his revolutionary name. And this man was someone who was half Slovene and half Croat. And, you know, he was a very brave person. You know, like he went and fought within World War One for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, you know, most people like know a little bit about the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So what you end up having was basically patchwork of different ethnicities, yeah. And that's because the borders of this were kind of drawn before the advent of like the nation state. So the idea of like nationhood and stuff, yeah, for most places in Europe and stuff, yeah, a very like new idea, right? Countries that we think of like Germany, Italy, all these different places, right? They didn't exist 200 years ago. These are like very, very recent phenomena in the grand scheme of things. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire ended up fighting in World War One on the same side as the Germans. And so Joseph Tito, when he ended up signing up for military service, he ended up fighting on the side of Austria, right? And when he was sent to the Eastern Front to go fight the Russians captured him in 1915. And, you know, while he was there, he ended up basically renouncing his Austrian citizenship because he was like, hold on, you know, the Russians and the Southern Slavs, we have a lot in common. We have far more in common with each other than I do with any of the Austrians. So I renounced my Austro-Hungarian citizenship, right? And while he was there, he also ended up becoming very influenced by communism, right? Russia at that time is obviously, you know, a melting pot when it comes to all the different kind of like radical groups, because lots of people wanting to overthrow like the Tsarist regime. And obviously one of the most notable one is the Bolsheviks. So he ended up having a very big part in all of this. And, you know, he even took part in the July days in 1917, and then later on in the October Revolution of that same year, right? So he's very instrumental in the setting up of what would later become the Soviet Union. And, you know, he even fought on the side of the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. However, upon his return from the Russian Civil War, the country which he had been born to, which was, you know, obviously the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, that collapsed at the end of World War One. And so the country he ended up coming back to was now called the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats and the Slovenes, which later became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Now, when he ended up obviously coming back, yeah, he ended up joining the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. And, you know, in the first election in 1920, which is what we discussed last time with the Spartacus Revolution, definitely check that out. You know, so they got 12.4% in that election. However, the King of Yugoslavia was not very happy with this, and so he decided to ban the communists and put them, you know, basically like repress them stuff, right? So the Communist Party of Yugoslavia ended up having to be put underground, right? And during all this time when he was basically a kind of an underground revolutionary and stuff, yeah, several years later in 1928 he ended up being arrested. and he ended up being arrested for 7 years. And so upon his release in 1935, he ended up fleeing to the Soviet Union. However, around this time, 1936, 1937, 38, etc., this is when Stalin did his Great Terror, right? This is known as the Purges. So this is when Stalin went through and got rid of many people, high-ranking communist leaders within the Soviet Union. But also, he also purged people from foreign communist parties as well, which happened to be in the Soviet Union. So part of the people that he ended up purging was the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. And Tito used this to his advantage, yeah. So he collaborated with Stalin and basically used this to rise to the top of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. Now, when World War II broke out, yeah, and the Germans and the Italians invaded Yugoslavia, Tito ended up coming back and he ended up being a communist partisan there. So obviously he was fighting against the Germans, fighting against the Italians, and he was fighting against local militia groups that were there, such as the, I think the Ukazi, I can't pronounce it, I might have said it wrong. But either way, these basically collaborators within Yugoslavia. So really, really bloody civil war there. And he was, he kind of rose to prominence during this time. And during the Civil War, this is when you have the alternative scenario, which we're going to kind of be looking at, right? So you had Otto Skorzeny, who was a very prominent person within the SS, and he was part of like the SD, which was like the intelligence branch of the SS. And this person was very, he was incredibly ruthless, of course, but also he was very instrumental in the freeing of Mussolini, right? So Mussolini had been captured in 1943, and he managed to have a daring kind of paragliding expedition, basically, that went and rescued Mussolini, right? So this man was he was almost kind of like some sort of James Bond figure, right? And, Hitler ended up saying, right, we need to get rid of this guy Tito because he's a major threat within Yugoslavia. And so Skorzeny ended up, having to orchestrate the capture or killing of Tito. However, Skorzeny ended up getting some intelligence that the plan had been foiled and that it had been infiltrated by the partisans, and so they knew that an attack was coming. But this is one of the funny things, right? Hitler encouraged the different intelligence branches, to compete with each other, right? And also, with the SS and the army as well. So everyone who was like below Hitler ended up competing with each other, even like his subordinates like Goering and Himmler, etc., etc. They were all encouraged to hate each other because by them all fighting each other and competing, first of all, it's the kind of Darwinian thing of survival of the fittest, yeah. And second of all, if everyone's fighting with each other, it means that no one's trying to fight with Hitler and stuff, right? So Hitler ends up being in charge, and no one is there to threaten him because there's no collaboration because everyone's in it for themselves. So this was a major problem, right? Because Skorzeny, found out about this, but he didn't pass this on to, the Waffen-SS. He didn't pass this on to anyone else, right? And so the secret that it had been foiled ended up kind of just being kept kept a secret. And so when the Germans sent in 12,000 troops, some of these paratroopers as well, and they had heavy bombing, heavy aerial bombardment of the camp as well. And this was up against 12,000 to 16,000 Yugoslav partisans led by Tito, right? But of course they knew that the attack was coming. They end up, they were very well prepared for it. And so as a result of this, almost 600 Germans end up being dead. And the Yugoslav partisans only lost 127. And then also as well, some people were captured. So for instance, there was a British intelligence officer who was there called Colonel Jack Churchill. As far as I'm aware, no relation to Churchill himself. But anyway, so he was captured, but Tito was able to get away. And basically the plot of this is what would have happened if the Germans had actually coordinated and actually collaborated with each other instead of fighting with each other. So if they'd shared the information, Tito probably would have been either captured or killed, and so Tito would never have then gone on to lead Yugoslavia. So why is it that Tito not leading Yugoslavia? Why is it such a big deal? Well, it's such a big deal because Tito, unlike the other communist kind of leaders within Eastern Europe, was not a puppet to Stalin, right? He was very independent-minded, and he kind of just did his own thing, right? And so that's basically why I'm doing this video, right? Because out of all the different leaders, he was the most interested. And he always put his own interest and his own nation's interest ahead of what was in Moscow's interest. So for instance, while the rest of Eastern Europe had been liberated by the Red Army troops, it was a thing where Tito said, right, you can come in, some of you can come in for a little bit just to help with the liberation, and as soon as it's done, you will have to leave, right? And that would never happen if you'd had any other communist leader, right? Any other communist leader would have just been like, okay, cool, and they just would have allowed the Soviet troops to be in there, and from there the Soviets would have basically been able to control the country. Now, it wasn't long before the Soviets withdrew that the splits began to kind of show, right? So, the so-called Tito-Stalin split began very, very early on, and it was over three main issues of contention. One was the Yugoslav occupation of the city of Trieste, which had been Italian, but basically Tito ended up taking over that. So as we all know from the famous Iron Curtain speech by Churchill, where he talked about from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, there's a reason why he said this was everything behind the Iron Curtain, because Trieste had been taken by Yugoslavia. And Stalin did not want this to happen because the communists were very, very strong in Italy, and he wanted Italy to be the next kind of communist country, right? And he knew that if he kind of allowed this, that it would end up annoying the Italian communists, right? And as we kind of discussed in previous videos, the Italian communists, they almost came very close to winning in the election of 1948. So they're a very powerful force, right? So best not to kind of annoy them, because then they can become part of your orbit, right? So it was over that. The second issue was over Bulgaria. So, as we kind of can see on the map here, Bulgaria is part of, what ought to be Yugoslavia in a way, right? Because it's southern and it's also Slavic, right? However, Yugoslavia had always been separate from Bulgaria. And although Tito and Stalin agreed that, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria ought to be united, they disagreed on how it ought to be united, right? So Stalin's idea was that Bulgaria and Yugoslavia would basically be, in much the same way as you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where you had a dual monarchy. Stalin basically wanted it to be a situation where it was a dual republic, right? So you'd have Bulgaria and you'd had Yugoslavia on equal footing. However, Tito was obviously not in favour of that, right? He wanted Bulgaria to kind of be added onto Yugoslavia. So he wanted it to be, seventh province of Yugoslavia. And so this kind of disagreement, that's the reason why Bulgaria never ended up joining Yugoslavia, because although it was in both leaders' ambitions, it was never realised because of the kind of contention over this, right? And then the third thing which split Stalin and Tito was over the issue of the Greek communists, So Greece was fighting a civil war. However, during World War II, there was a meeting in which Stalin and Churchill end up going for drinks. And during this very heavy drinking bout, basically, they end up sitting down, and Churchill got out a bit of paper and a pen, and he started drawing out kind of rough sketches of different percentages for the different countries of Eastern Europe, right? So he basically said something along the lines of Greece would be 90% British influence, and it would be 10% Soviet, and then this country would be that, and etc., right? So that was basically kind of a way of carving up Eastern Europe, and basically talking about different spheres of influence, right? So Stalin kind of kept his word on that. So although Greece being communist would have actually helped the Soviets in on a geostrategic kind of level, because he had this prior agreement with Churchill, he kind of knew actually there'd be too much reaction from this, if the Soviets got directly involved in this. And so that's why he didn't support the Greek communists, because he was don't want to annoy the West too soon, right? However, Tito disagreed with this and basically said that they should support the Greek communists, right? So this was just another split that ended up basically annoying them, right? And as a result, Tito basically kind of said, right, we're no longer kind of part of the Soviet bloc, although we never really were. We are going to be independent, and we're going to try for a third way, right? And obviously Stalin was very, very pleased with this and said, yep, go, best of luck to you. No, I'm joking. He sent assassins, right? And what's quite funny, actually, is that he tried to send multiple assassins, but each time they kept getting caught. And Tito ended up writing a letter to Stalin, which was really, really funny. This is some gangster stuff, right? He said, right, paraphrasing here, of course, right? Because I can't speak Serbian or whatever language he was speaking, right? But he wrote to him and said, right, you keep sending assassins, and we keep catching them, right? If you send another one, I'll send an assassin to Moscow, and I won't have to send another one. So that's basically the long and short of the story. And there's some rumors that, because this happened roughly around the same time that Stalin ended up dying, and there's been debates among historians as to what basically caused the death of Stalin. And some people, especially in Yugoslavia, have said that Tito might have had a hand in that. So that's just something to kind of bear in mind, yeah, that he might have just sent that one assassin and that might have just done the trick. But Tito's leadership also had another big impact in terms of, like the geopolitics of the region and stuff, right? Because one of the things that he really pushed for was the fact of, okay, you've got two major blocks here. You've got the Eastern Bloc, which is led by the Soviet Union, and you've got the Western Bloc, which is led by the USA, right? Most countries in the world don't want to be kind of sucked into this kind of superpower rivalry, right? We kind of just want to do our own thing. We want to have good relationship with both blocks. We're not to pick and size. This is your lot beef. Just like leave me out of it, right? And so, Tito ended up being very instrumental in the setting up of the so-called non-aligned movement, right? So this had people like Nero from India, had people from Indonesia, had multiple different countries around the world, especially some of like the newly independent countries as well in Africa and like just in Asia in general. So he was like really influential in that. So much so that the very first summit, which was held for the non-aligned movement, or NAM, was in Belgrade, right, in 1961. So, without his leadership of that, it might have kind of taken off and stuff, yeah, but it would have been nowhere near as influential of movement as it was during the Cold War as it otherwise might have been. And on top of this as well, we have to obviously say the very obvious thing: he was a communist dictator. So obviously he tortured people and he killed people, etc., etc. But in the grand scheme of things, he was nowhere near as bad as the Soviets were, right? As a matter of fact, he criticized the Soviets when they sent in tanks to crush Hungary in 1956, and also when they sent in troops to crush Czechoslovakia in 1968, right? So he kind of just really wanted to just go his own way and stuff. And the problem with him being independent is that he kind of sent a message to all the other leaders of Eastern Europe, like, hey, there's an alternative. You don't have to be controlled by Moscow. You can kind of have communism and, as they say, like kind of have socialism with a human face as such, right? So this obviously really threatened the power balance of the Soviet Union. So if Tito had been killed during the war, then there's every chance that, it would have just been another country within like the Eastern Bloc. And if there had been any kind of uprising at all, it would have been crushed. And on top of some of these liberal reforms, he had something known as a workplace democracy, right? So I'm normally in favour of this idea. However, there have to be some limits to this, right? So it was good in the sense of, instead of in like how you have in most communist countries where everything is decided by like the central planners in the government, right? And so people in a far off capital deciding what the price in like somewhere else in like the provinces is going to be for like wheat, or what the price of like toilet paper is going to be, etc., etc. It's just mad levels of price controls and everything, right? And like direct ownership of things, right? However, under this system, you basically gave like the workers in each kind of factory the control over how the factory ought to be run, which sounds great in theory. However, while I'm in favour of like people having a say on who their management should be, so voting for your management, maybe like voting for like what the pay ratio ought to be between management and workers, it becomes problematic when the workers themselves can take control over the entire company. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out some of the reasons why this system might not exactly work, right? First of all, if workers have the choice between paying themselves more or investing in things, right, they will choose higher salaries because you don't know how long they're going to be working there for. Investments, they might work out, it might not work out, etc., etc. And so they end up basically just like using the company as like a cash cow to get as much as they want, right? And this in the long term ends up leading to a great reduction in the level of investment within the economy, because all the new innovations, all the new kind of things trying out and stuff, right, don't end up happening because like there's no market for it. And on top of that as well, youth unemployment ends up being very, very high because the people who are already in their jobs, they don't want to share the pie more by hiring more workers, right? So it ends up just being a very kind of closed shop, and the whole economy ends up kind of disintegrating in this kind of way, right? And obviously having large numbers of unemployed young people is not very good, especially when you've got a country which is repressive, but then also kind of liberal, so people can speak out and stuff. And on top of that, you've got multiple different ethnic groups and religious groups all competing with each other, etc., etc. And this is another thing where I have to really, some people would like overplay Tito's role in this, and it's to do with his power of keeping Yugoslavia together. So one of the arguments that people often make is that Tito was able to keep Yugoslavia together for as long as it was because, the fact he was half Croat and half Slovene, it meant that he was able to basically balance out the different ethnicities, right? Because, Yugoslavia was dominated by Serbia, and so if you had a Serb leader, then the other groups would be a bit annoyed, right? But the fact that he was kind of, straddled these two minority ethnicities, it meant that it kind of had a lot more credibility and a lot more kind of like popular support amongst different people. So he led Yugoslavia up until 1980, which is when he died. However, something to note is that it's not like as soon as he died, Yugoslavia kind of collapsed. Yugoslavia collapsed because communism ended up collapsing, right? So after like the Berlin Wall ended up collapsing, a few years after that, USSR ended up collapsing, and then also Yugoslavia collapsed as well. So the civil wars that you end up having in Bosnia and like all the different like breakaway countries, like if you look at a map of Yugoslavia now, it's literally just Serbia now. You can't really make the argument, I don't think, that he helped to keep the country together. I think that under whatever kind of leadership you had, if you had a tyrannical like leadership, very top down and stuff, and doesn't allow the different like people to kind of dissent and stuff, then you can keep the country together. But when you've got like such different groups, as soon as that central like command economy kind of like goes away, as soon as that kind of like that tyranny kind of goes, you can't have a democratic system with that many ethnic groups. It just doesn't work. Everyone's all kind of competing with each other, and the whole thing would have broken down anyway. So I think that with the collapse of communism, you are bound to have a disintegration of Yugoslavia. So whether it happened in like the 90s or whenever it happened, right? As soon as you have that centralization go away, the rest of it's going to split away. Because a good model for this is the USSR itself, right? You obviously had the Russians, who were the main ethnic group, but they had control over the other smaller ones. And so as soon as you kind of like loosen things up a little bit, all these other groups go, right, we're going to split away, we're going to split away, we're going to split away. So that was bound to kind of happen. So I don't think, if you had like a pro-Moscow kind of like puppet regime that was there instead of Tito, regardless, as soon as the Iron Curtain falls, Yugoslavia would fall as well. So that's basically my take on it. So let me know what you think in the comment section. And also as well, we've got merch. So, we're going to do a little trick. Let's see whether it actually works or not. So 3, 2, 1, and... So 3, 2, 1, and... 3, 2, 1, and... See? Voila. Hey, so we've got the merch in it, right? So basically, I end up getting a jacket. Very, very nice. Very nice. The collar might be a little bit questionable and stuff, but obviously this is just a prototype, right? So we might decide to go with a slightly different make, right? But this is what we have at the moment. You can check on our Instagram page for what it actually looks like. And then we've got this, obviously, nice little polo shirt. We've got notebook. I've even started making little notes in it. Look at that. Fancy, fancy. Yeah, that's my to-do list. Actually, you probably shouldn't be looking at what's in the to-do list. But we've got a key ring as well. It's a little bit off-center. But obviously when we get the proper ones, it will look good. And as well, we have a nice little pen as well. A little... nice little inscription. And it's in black ink, right? But obviously you can get blue ink or whatever. So that's essentially what we have at the moment. So let me know in the comment section, or message me on our Instagram page, and just let me know what things you'd kind of be interested in getting. So if you want the jacket, just write in the comment section, jacket looks better, because then I can start compiling a kind of bit of data and basically be like, right, people are more interested in this and people are less interested in that, and then I know what to kind of mass order, because obviously me buying just the prototypes are relatively expensive, but obviously if I get in bulk, then the net price goes down. But I don't want to get like 1,000 jackets and people don't really want it. If people want the shirts more, then and also as well, people have any more suggestions, I'm looking at getting coffee mugs as well, and multiple different things, right? So if anyone's got any ideas, please let me know. And anyway, enough of a shameless plug. Also got a Patreon account as well, but yeah, but yeah, anyway, so if you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share with your friends, sharing is caring, as we always say. The next video is going to be on what if Napoleon never invaded Russia, right? So we're looking at the Napoleonic Wars, we're looking at 1812, we're looking at the huge impact that had on Europe, to do with like the the defeat of Napoleon, and then also culturally, like kind of and historically, what impact it had on Mother Russia. So yeah, so with that being said, have a great day and bye.